the Tower of London. It was an armoury for a fortress. This being a fortress, it had an army here, so that's where all our armoury used to be kept. The top floor is where the kings and queens used to live. That's where the royal apartments were on the top floor. Then windows aren't the original windows, obviously. They were placed there in the 17th century by Sir Christopher Wren. The middle floor that you see, that was for knights and their ladies. That had a banqueting hall and a big dining room. The large windows, that's where soldiers, servants and retainers used to stay. There is a floor below ground that you cannot see. This was for stores and provisions, but it did have a much more sinister use as a dungeon and a torture chamber. Behind you, when we go through, you're going to see Traitor's Gate. That was originally called the Watergate. It later became known as Traders' Gate, but when the three queens of England, Queen Anne Boleyn, Queen Catherine Howard and Lady Jane Grey, came through those gates to be executed up here on Tower Green, it then became known as Traitor's Gate. Now the tower has held many prisoners over the years. Some infamous characters have been held here. In the Queen's House in the corner, which is a big white Tudor building. In fact, that's the largest Tudor building to survive the Great Fire of London. When the Great Fire of London was taking place, the building that you see behind me at the far end there, that's the Waterloo block. That used to be the Grand Storehouse. They went in, they got a load of explosive out, they blew all the buildings up along the west side. Now this made a firewall which actually saved the tower from burning, getting caught up in the Great Fire of London. The three queens, they were brought up onto Tower Green, as I say, and they were beheaded up there, and then they're all buried up in the Chapel Royal of St Peter at Vincula. So the three queens are buried in there. There's some other famous people in there, Sir Thomas More, he's buried in there as well, plus many, many others. When that was renovated in 1876, they removed a load of chairs in there, a load of stools, a load of heavy seating. They removed the balcony, they restored the windows, put the Spanish ceiling, and they dug the floor up so they could lay a new floor. When they dug the floor up, they discovered the skeletal remains of over 1,000 bodies inside there. So there was quite a few people that were executed and placed in there. The reasons they were placed in there, it wasn't a religious thing, it wasn't a nice thing to do. What they would do is chop the heads off on Tower Hill, put the heads on London Bridge, bring the bodies in here and throw them in an empty grave. If your body and your head wasn't together, you couldn't be martyred or sainted. The other reason was you didn't know where the body was, so you couldn't go in and mourn the body that was in there. Okay. Just the other side of this wall here, that's where the ravens are. You've all heard about the ravens at the Tower of London. Now that goes back to King Charles II, astrologers working in the northeast corner, the first Royal Observatory. They complained to the king as to the noise and the mess the ravens were making. So the king ordered for all the ravens to be banished. But he was reminded of an ancient legend that said if the ravens were to leave, the White Tower would crumble to dust. Great disaster before the nation and the monarchy would fall. Being a rather superstitious king at this stage, having suffered two great disasters already, the Black Plague in lost my dates now. When was the Great Fire of London? 1666. The Black Plague in 1665 and the Great Fire of London in 1666. He could not resist the third, so he said a raven master be appointed from the own body, paid extra money to care and look after the ravens, and a minimum of 6 ravens is to be kept here at the Tower of London at all times. Just behind you there's a square building. You can see 2 sets of windows. The lower one, inside there's in the daytime, there's an exhibition to Sir Walter Raleigh. He spent 13 years of his life imprisoned in the bloody tower. Now they went to torture him, but they didn't know what to do. So the worst torture they could think of was to place a man in prison where he couldn't get out of them 4 walls, and they put his wife and children in there with him. Can you think of anything worse? The top floor, that's where the 2 boy princes, the young crowned King Edward V, aged 12, and his younger brother, Richard the Duke of York, aged 9, they were smothered to death. They were under the care of their uncle, Richard the Duke of Gloucester. Their young bodies were then bundled down the stairs and buried under a pile of stones. The next day, an unnamed priest moved the bodies and buried them in an area on the south side of the White Tower. There they remained undiscovered for 191 years, until workmen, during the time of King Charles II, carrying out some work, discovered a chest. Upon opening this chest, it was seen to contain the skeletal remains of 2 small bodies. Experts of the day declared that these were the 2 boy princes. On the orders of the king, they were taken to Westminster Abbey, where they were interned into Innocents' Corner, and that's where they remain to this day. In the 1930s, they were exhumed. They'd done some measurements of some bones, and they said that's the bones of a young boy of about 9, and that's the bones of a boy around 12. They were then placed back in and buried in. Now DNA testing has now progressed massively, so they're now called to exhume the bodies once again to do some proper DNA testing to find out who they are. But it won't make an ounce of difference. It's not going to declare that there's a chip-chop bloke who works over in Bermondsey is now the King of England. It's not going to happen. So the Queen, she said, no matter who these people are, they're 2 young boys, let's leave them in peace. They've been unrest for 191 years. They've been brought out of their graves the second time. She doesn't want it to happen. In future, the next one of the other monarchs may say they want to do some testing themselves, but at the moment the Queen, she's just said leave them there. Everyone all right? Questions? Cool, follow me.